Hi, welcome back to day 2 of Shakespeare, or if this is your first day, you really should go back now and watch part 1. This is for Simmons College Kentucky's Arts 102 Intro to Theatre course, which I did. Hi. Most of you have seen me from class, so this shouldn't be too shocking. As before, I will be tackling Shakespeare in an incredibly reduced and diminished fashion, and there will be a couple of little things I hide in and around today for you to pick up on to get those bonus or additional or final points. I think, let me check quickly. 1, 2, 3. 3 things today to find. Same points available as the last day. It'll let me know that you were into it, so to speak, or at least watched it through. Anyway, today what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of the different bits and pieces of Shakespeare that I didn't cover. We're going to look at some of the stage tricks and techniques that were used, or things that were common in his time. We'll look at the types of plays that were happening in Shakespeare's era. We are going to look at a little bit of the text specifically to do with the porter. Yeah, he's like not a major character. No, why aren't you talking about the major speeches? Everybody else talks about the major speeches. If you want to go and look up about the major speeches, people far more qualified and famous than I will be talking about them. I will talk about the stuff that nobody else is really talking about. And speaking of, yeah, everybody talks about this. I want to talk about the morality in the play and how it connects with what we as modern 21st century people who have a strong moral compass, often influenced by Christianity, as I would imagine most of you in front of me are. How does he stack up against us? And then we're going to see how this play stacks up against today. What does it look like in the modern world? But before we begin, anything interesting happened to any of you since the last video, which may literally have been watched a few seconds before you watched this? Anyone? Anyone do anything interesting? Yeah? You can pause now so you can tell the whole of your story. I'm not going to do this all day. Right, we will get on with the tricks and the techniques of Shakespeare, because he was a tricky fella and it's all very technical. We keep on doing Shakespeare. I like the stuff. I think it's good, but it also has a legacy. And particularly if you're going to say, yeah, I did a theatre course in college, somebody's going to say, well, what's your favourite Shakespeare play? Or some guff like that. Or why do we do Shakespeare? I hate Shakespeare. I like it. I'm lucky. I hated it when I was in school. In school, it was a case of learning off lines that seemed to be in a foreign language that nobody tried to explain. All about older folks. Oh dear, here we go. Where do I go? I'll go up here. And yet there's a lot that we could learn from it that's useful stuff. So you can read all the other stuff. This is in that email and on that Google page, that if you want to look it up in more depth and take time with it. But this is all stuff I've put together. There's a few different things that keep on showing up. My favorite one is the aside, because this is one of those things that was really popular back then. It still shows up now and again. An aside is where two people are having a perfectly good conversation on stage, and then one turns to the audience and breaks the fourth wall. Now, that's a term we use a lot. The fourth wall is sort of, if you're watching a play that's set in a kitchen, you might see 3 walls. The fourth wall is the imaginary one between you and in the audience and those on the stage. And when you're breaking the fourth wall, you're saying, hey, I see you, audience. Here's what's going on. Asides normally had this wonderful possibility of wickedness. And wickedness, as we know, not something we want in real life, but we can enjoy it on stage. So it would be a case of, oh yeah, no, I'm really enjoying spending time with you. You're such a great friend, and you've been so nice to me, and I hate this guy. This guy is killing me. He is like the worst person I know. That kind of thing. Yeah, I'm going back to the conversation now. This kind of thing shows up in a lot more modern TV and stuff than you would expect. There's elements of it you could argue trace back to the Greeks when you had certain cast members talking directly to us. But this is slightly different because the difference here is that we are doing that. We're living in the real world where people talk to each other. And now we're going to turn around and ignore that in order to get information to the audience or to let the audience in on something. In a modern context, you see that in shows like House of Cards, Fleabag, if any of you are watching that. If you want to know about white women who in their 30s in London, that is the show to go to. As a white woman in her 30s in London, I love it. And many others beyond. That moment where somebody just sort of looks to the camera and goes, when they're looking away from the actual cast. You know this from shows you watch. You know that kind of character who shows up here and there and they kind of live beyond the reality of the show. Asides. I love them. And yeah, normally it's a case of, my dear friend, it's great to see you. I'm going to kill him in the next 10 minutes. That is my aim. That is my desire. That's gone on an awful lot long about it because nobody talks about asides. Everybody normally talks about soliloquies. Oh, the soliloquies are great. So they're different to asides in the sense that these are both monologues that are kind of played out to the audience. But in the case of an aside, the character is looking and talking to you. It's like, hey, I'm Richard III. Those guys, I gotta kill them in order to be the king. You're in it with me. Yeah, we're buds. Yeah. With soliloquies, it's described as we overhear them a lot of the time. It's basically they're talking to themselves. It's internal monologue, if you like. It's like, oh, I am so unhappy. Oh, it's hard to be a prince or whatever guff like that. Soliloquies, you get a lot more of them in Macbeth than you get asides. Asides tend to be for a certain kind of a play. I'll talk about that a little later. Not so much tragedies or sometimes in comedies, but more in something called a revenge tragedy. Dramatic irony. So you knew as soon as I started putting up these things that based on what I'd done the last day, the gag is that I make things harder for myself to be seen and to talk to you. You know this, but the character I'm playing when I'm delivering this lecture to you does not realize what I have done. So yeah, I set this gag up deliberately all the way in the first episode to teach you this lesson. Dramatic irony. You say, oh yeah, he's going to put up something on screen, and he's done it again. He's obscured himself. He's made it difficult for himself. It's a good gag, but it's really the case of where the audience knows more than the person that something's about to happen to. In Romeo and Juliet, the audience knows, spoilers on a 400-year-old play, look away now, probably need to plug your ears. The audience knows that Juliet is only pretending to be dead. She has taken a potion that makes it look like she is dead, but she's not. The audience knows this. Romeo doesn't know this until too late. Dramatic irony. Comic relief. And that's what we're going to be talking about the Porter as regards. Yeah, there's this idea in art. It dates back to the 14th century in the Western tradition, at least from Italy. And they called it chiaroscuro, which basically means the light in darkness. The idea is that if you want something to feel darker, make something around the edges brighter so that what's within feels darker. Normally the way they did it was they made painting all around them in much darker tones. So it works in reverse as well. And that's what the Porter does in this. He's the comedy in the middle to make everything feel, oh God, this is awful miserable, or whatever way you want to see it. This is bleak because I was laughing. Prologues and epilogues. These are useful little things. They're tricks and techniques that cover the role of a narrator. If you watched 1980s TV soap, you'd have previously on Dynasty, and then you'd see what happened in the previous episode. Here, you don't really get that as much, but what you would have is things that give you the background to what it. The one I always go to is Romeo and Juliet. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. I know I keep saying those lines, but we're talking about two families, both alike in dignity. They're equally matched in fair Verona where we lay our scene. Immediately in those 4 short lines, we get a little bit of the detail, and it goes on to describe more. That's a prologue. An epilogue is kind of that. It was really popular in 1960s black and white American TV, where you'd have this 4-act thing, and then you'd have the epilogue where they'd said what happened to those people who were in that car accident or whatever. And that's what it is. It's something to sort of wrap it up, to put everything together. Neither of these things appear in Macbeth in any real sense, or do they? Up to you to decide. And finally, it happened in Spain or Italy, or maybe France. So Britain had become a non-Catholic country, because, you know, coming from where I'm from, there are Catholic countries and there are non-Catholic countries. Britain had become Episcopalian, as you'd call it, Anglican, as some would call it, but it was really Church of England is what they called it. And that meant that all the Catholics were wrong and evil and terrible. So if you wanted to have something wicked and naughty happen, that might be a little bit of fun, it might be enjoyable to an audience, set it in the Catholics. They don't count as people, so they can do all these fun things. They can be wicked and immoral and irresolute and dissolute and all that kind of stuff. But they're Catholics, so it doesn't matter, does it? We have done similar kinds of othering in America over the years. I don't know, maybe the whole bit where non-white people are treated as less. I don't know if you'd have any recognition of that kind of experience. Maybe watch any movie before 2008, maybe, where, yeah, that kind of thing. That's what Spain and Italy are for. Those are other people. They can have bad things happen to them. We don't need that to be happening here. Because if we did that, then we would be just like them, and there wouldn't have been any point in us having massive, massive death tolls over changing religion, would there? All right. So those are some of the tricks and the techniques that are used on stage in that era. Shakespeare used all of them in different ways, but they all did. And we still use some of them in some ways, as I've said. We'll have a look at some of the kinds of plays that were in the day. Quick reminder first, the way acts were broken up. Acts were broken up into rough movements. You can see it there in front of you, where we talk about exposition, rising action, etc., etc. You can read that. You have plenty of time to. Most of you know this already. Writers didn't line them up that way. Scholars and critics afterwards did. In the case of Shakespeare, in many of the original, from what we know, it was literally one scene after another. So in something like Macbeth, I think there's something like 35, 40 scenes. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe 25 scenes. And afterwards, people have decided what fits with what act. Let's get into the detail. The nuts and bolts. Tragedies and comedies. We've got a few examples here of tragedy by Shakespeare, King Lear, Julius Caesar, Macbeth. 'Tis Pity She's a Whore by John Ford is great fun, in the sense that, of course, happened in a Catholic country because it's a brother who is madly in love with his sister, but the sister's getting married off by the parents. So now everybody's going to die. It's fun. I know it's a tragedy. It's a lot of fun. Comedies, they don't always settle as well this far into the future, because what ultimately ends up happening is a lot of these shows, their comedy is based on linguistic stuff that changes. It's changed. It's based on things that happen satirically, locally. You know, famous people may be mocked and what have you. So it doesn't always play through. So Much of It Do About Nothing, Midsummer Night's Dream, they're fairly famous in terms of Shakespeare's. Them and maybe Twelfth Night are his most popular. As You Like It, I suppose. I never liked As You Like It, so I never use it. They're probably some of his most popular comedies. The Malcontent by John Marston is a typical kind of thing. It comes straight from a guy called Menander, who was an ancient Greek. He wrote sort of Friends-style episodic comedy. This is that kind of thing. Massive reduction, but that's it in a nutshell. Now, tragedies and comedies, tragedies, the main characters end badly. Comedies, the main characters end well. There were other kinds of plays. We tend to focus on the tragedies and comedies. I want to focus on having a look at some of these other ones. And I'm going to recommend, pay close attention to all of these, because I would like you to pick one of these play types and pick a TV show or a movie that fairly well represents it. So if you can think of a movie that is kind of like a history play, let me know one. This is mission number 1 in your list of things I'm going to make you do to make it seem like you've read or you've watched this thing. History plays. So they're also known as chronicle plays. Hugely popular. They were the most popular plays in the day because, like in the religious plays before them, in the centuries that preceded this, it told a story to an illiterate population. You learned your history from going to the theatre, just like you learned your religion from going to your own vernacular language productions of stories from the Bible. That was what was happening back 400 years ago. Now, most of these sources were questionable because guess what? If you are paying the man to write your history and you've won the war, he's going to make you sound like an absolute giant of a man. If you lose the war, the next guy's going to make you sound like a nobody, an inevitable embarrassment in our history. Now, English history was nearly always of the kings. There's not really, most of the history plays are named for kings. The one obvious exception is King Lear, which is not about a king, not about a real king. It wasn't a history play. It was complete fiction. Normally, they support the current regime. So Shakespeare at one point wrote a play called Henry VIII. I think it was during the time of Queen Elizabeth. And it's all about Henry VIII being a great man who overturned Catholicism because of the nobleness of his demeanour and how much he loved his new wife Anne Boleyn, who was Queen Elizabeth's mother, who also was executed, just so as you know. But it made her sound great, and it made all of her sound fantastic, so the Queen would like it. Seldom do they mention the reigning monarch because that's a bit gauche. It's, like going to a party wearing the same frock as somebody else. You don't want to do that. People will think you're daft. A lot of the time they're like tragedies because they kind of try to chart a story, but they make a story of it. Because in reality, when things happen, they don't happen in a planned, ordered way. Stuff happens on 1 week and then nothing about that happens for 6 weeks more and then it pops up again. There's been other stuff in the meantime. We're not going to do that. Henry VI parts 1, 2 and 3 do that. They sort of nicely, neatly say, oh, all the stuff with the French is going to happen in part 1 and all the stuff that happens with the revolt of the normal people happens in Act 2 or part 2, and in part 3 we'll have the overthrow of Henry VI by the next guy on, who is Richard III. Richard III is so much fun because he's a villain and he has fun with it. Shakespeare really has a good go, and that's one of the few history plays that kind of transcends English history. Complete Lies, Henry III was not nearly as bad a person as all that play says. Christopher Marlowe wrote a play called Edward II. King John was a play written by dozens of different people as well. There are loads of them if you go looking through these old geezers' back catalogues. Revenge tragedies. There you have it. That first line is really all you need. They're like telenovelas compared to, serious drama that happens after the watershed. If you've not watched a telenovela, watch one episode. It's amazing. Don't worry about the language. It doesn't matter. There's often secret murders, ghosts urging that they be avenged. And note that in this time, because they had dispatched with the Catholicism, all ghosts were immediately expected to be serving Satan himself, serving the devil. So when you see ghosts appear and witches appear in Shakespeare, like they do in this play, you know that the audience who's watching are thinking, oh, these are bad guys, do not trust these guys. Which may be something that Hamlet, in his play, should have learned, because he takes his bidding from a ghost. Disguise and deception is necessary. Normally the disguises and deceptions are flimsy, but it doesn't matter. The main thing is we know that they're meant to be pretending to be somebody else. Somebody is or pretends to be mad. Yep, that's really common. Violence in the big body count at the end. Very, very regular. The revenger seldom survives the bloodbath. This all describes a play called Hamlet. Yep, all that stuff is basically what happens in it. Calling it a tragedy is not fair. It's a revenge tragedy. So other ones, Titus Andronicus, which is based on an ancient Roman story. The Atheist Revenge, The Revenger's Tragedy, The Changeling, and the really wicked Jew of Malta. I mean, there is major anti-Semitism in that play, but if it wasn't for that, it would be a lot of fun. Romances are one of these kind of odd ones. They generally get called, in Shakespeare's case, problem plays, because they don't fit nicely into comedy, history, or tragedy. They tend, you can read all the stuff there. I find them interesting, and sometimes they're really beautiful. They have a lot of masks, which I'll talk about in a little bit, generally at some point, or pastoral scenes. And it takes really seriously the idea that tragedy plus time equals comedy. Normally there's great sorrow at the beginning, and with time, and oftentimes in these plays, it's years. There's like, I think it's 16 or 17 years between the beginning of Pericles and the end of it. And that's really unusual, like the opposite of what the ancient Greeks suggested was necessary. So yeah, it also does a lot of contrasting. It matches very closely something called the mystery plays, the morality plays of the previous era, which I've not talked about. Maybe we might want to talk about them. You let me know. But morality plays were very kind of transparent. These are somewhat transparent. We get to contrast goodness and badness most of the time. They're practically religious in certain ways. So it's all unlikely and improbable stuff. I'm sure you can find movies that are very similar to these romances. I can think of a couple. Explores what happens when opposite meet. So you might get a city person out in the countryside, or a country person sent to the city. Anyway, moving on from this one, we go to, some examples of romances. And Shakespeare was the master of them. And having read a few, he was the master of them. The Tempest is a famous one. That may be the only play that he wrote originally, and he did that with John Fletcher. Cymbeline, A Winter's Tale, and Pericles. Philaster from Beaumont and Fletcher. It's a good example why Shakespeare has survived and they haven't, in terms of a big name. Masks now. This is weird. This is kind of... Yeah, I'll get to it in a moment. Entertainment mostly for the aristocracy. It arose from the tradition of masked players performing for the local noblemen, with singing and dancing, the audience brought into it, and it always sort of is a bit of a hagiography of the king or noble. Shakespeare's put these in some of the plays, mostly in the romances, but there's sort of an inverted version of this in Macbeth. That bit where all the ghosts go walking. You know you should have watched it, don't you now? Now I've spoiled it for you. The bit where all the ghosts, the parade of future king comes walking out, is an inverted mask. It's a dark mask, because the masks were normally fun, light, and easy. And this is kind of the work that Ben Jonson did. He wrote a play called, I can't remember what it was, The Queen's Mask, where the Queen and her maids-in-waiting performed this play for the king. In many ways, you could liken it to a fashion show. It doesn't really have anything much to say, but it's very pretty and beautiful, and it's enjoyable, and yeah, past a half an hour. Now, these are my main men, the Jigs. I have only found one. I'm not a researcher, I'm not paid to research, so it doesn't make sense that I would have found many at this point. They're like something that existed in ancient Greek times called the satyr play. After you'd done 3 heavy tragedies in the one day, then oftentimes the playwright would be expected to produce something short, fun and frothy to take the edge off what you've just watched. So they call them satyr plays, and this is kind of a satyr play. It's fun, it's light, musical interludes, crowd pleasing, very much aimed at ordinary folks. And, you know, it's very simple rhymes, very simple stuff, but it's believed that these things may have happened between acts in the major plays. Again, taking from the ancient Greek example before them. Now, that's done. That's a little bit about the types of plays that there were. I'm going to take a moment now to look at the porter. So the porter shows up in the middle of the play, comes in around Act 2, Scene 3. Let me get this up here. Oh, that's it. No, that's the wrong button. That's the button I want. There we go. Aha! I win. Oh, wait, there's more. Screw you guys. Okay, let's see. Hello. So the porter comes in at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 3. The immediate scene before this, sorry guys, spoilers, you should have watched the play by now. The immediate scene before this was the scene where we discover that Macbeth has murdered Duncan and then murdered his two servants. The servants had been gotten drunk. Macbeth was able to, and given a knockout potion in their drink, Macbeth was able to sneak in and murder the king. He goes back, his wife goes, you did murder the servants as well. No, you got to blame them, murder them, and all will be good. So he goes off and he murders them. Like in the ancient Greek plays, the bad stuff here happens off stage, which lulls us into a false sense of security that we will come back to at a later point. When Lady Macduff in the next act is killed in front of us, as is her child. So we're thinking they're not going to show us anything bad. They show us bad. Anyway, the porter, after this really gruesome, scary thing, and remember, in England, it is to this day high treason, an executable offence, to think about the death or to plot the murder of your king. Just talking about it is enough to have you, in theory, eligible to be executed. I was not executed for high treason, despite many times committing it when I lived in Britain. And that's somebody else's voice if the British forces are watching me. Anyway, the porter comes on, and we've had all this serious, heavy stuff. Ancient Scotland, dark, moody, witches, death, murder, all kinds of bad stuff. And then we get to this. We get this knocking, and out comes the porter. I could read this, but you know what? Either I'm going to manage to get this worked out so I can put the video in here now, in which case, great, watch that. Or I will have a link flash up on the screen somehow. I'm sure I can do this. Which will cut you to the footage. So click on the link or watch it now.
Here's a knocking, indeed. A man with porter of hell gate, he should have old, turning the key. No. Who's there? In the name of Beelzebub. Faith, here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Oh. Come in, time server. Have napkins enough about you. Here, you'll sweat for it. Not who's there in the other devil's name. Faith, here's an equivocator who can swear, in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Come in, equivocator. Knock, 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 who's there? Faith, here's an English tailor. You come hither for stealing. Oh, dear. Out of a French hose, Oh, ha, 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 ha. Come in, tailor. Here you may roast your goose. No, no, never a quiet. What are you? But this place is too cold for hell. I'll devil portrait no further. I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire. Anon. Anon. I pray you, remember the porter. Oh.
So, enjoy that. I'm sure you did. It's in a Scottish accent, so that's going to be harder to follow. Here, the script's up on the screen now for you. You'd be glad of that. And what's also interesting is that guy goes on to be Emperor Palpatine. That is the Emperor from Star Wars before he was in a Star Wars film. I think literally he was filming one just after this went out. Anyway, so we have a porter here. A porter is a guy who opens the door. Ignore the weirdness and staginess of that production, and it makes some sense. Let's get to the meat of it. Knock, knock. Who's there in the name of Beelzebub? Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time, have napkins enow about you, and here you'll sweat for it. He's basically saying, in a few short lines there, you'll notice this is not verse. This is prose. There's no kind of nice little line ending there, is there? It is run-on sentences. Knock, knock, who's there in the name of Beelzebub? He's bringing out already the name of one of Satan's cohort here to get things on the road. Who's there in the name of Beelzebub? Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Here is a farmer who banked on making a fortune off a harvest. It didn't come in. This is a biblical verse, those of you who are biblical scholars. This is also a real experience, those of you who have lived lives. I can only imagine that given how much plague and famine there was going casually through the likes of Britain at this point, that what ended up happening was at some point along here, somebody took a nasty turn and somebody did not do well. And farmers oftentimes, if he hanged himself on the expectation of plenty, it could mean one of two things. Number one, that he had built his he had made plans based on getting plenty. He had hanged himself on it. He had put himself up to that. Or that he had hanged himself because the crop did not do well enough for him. Come in time, have napkins enow about you. You'll sweat for it. Here you'll sweat for it. We're talking about hell. But this is satirical stuff. He's taking the mickey out of, he's getting a rise out of, I don't know what you say over here. He's mocking farmers. This is all political satirical stuff. Particularly in the city, they'll be happy to laugh at the farmers. The farmers to them seem wealthy types, but they don't have anything, certainly no education. Knock, knock. Who's there in the other devil's name? Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Or come in, equivocator, who could swear in both the scales against either scale. We're talking about a lawyer, a person who practices the law. I'm married to one of those. So we're mocking lawyers now. Then the next one on. Knock, knock, who's there? Faith, here's an English tailor come hither for stealing out a French hose. Come in, tailor, you may roast your goose. A tailor's goose was kind of like an iron, I think. It was used extensively in sewing and making costumes. Of course, roasting your goose, Uh, what's the phrase? My goose. I can't remember if it's my goose. What bird it is? But you know the phrase where, yeah, I'm done for. I am in trouble. So these are three speeches that are mocking farmers, lawyers, and tailors. I think, if I've read right, at this time in England's history, there was a shortage of hose, and people wanted good English hose, not the foreign muck. Of course, you know it's like everybody wants their MAGA hat to not be made in China, but it is. And so similarly, yeah, claiming that your French hose was English, oh, that's a terrible thing. That's nearly a treasonous thing to do. Knock, knock, never quiet. Where are ye? But this place is too cold for hell. I'll devil porter it no further. I had thought to have let in some of all professions that go the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire. Anon, I pray you, remember the porter. Anon, I pray you, remember the porter. Would you let me be for 5 seconds? I'm coming. And then he kind of turns to us. This is the only aside really in Macbeth, and says, remember the porter. That's me. Generally, he's played as drunk. And it makes sense. Because as he speaks on, if you watch the rest of that scene, he speaks on, he talks of basically being drunk. In some cases, they make him embarrassingly drunk. I just think he should be like a bit merry and, yeah, I don't care. Here, this place is a hell, except it's too cold to be hell. So we are talking about a world that is not the standard Christian place. A place that is hell, but too cold for it. Or if you like to call it such, Scotland. Now, before I move on to the next bit, I'm going to take a break here because I have to get a child to bed and all that kind of stuff, and it's late night, hence the lights all over. Before I move on, what I need you to do is, we've hit farmers, we've hit the, what are they called? The lawyers, the lawyer who cannot equivocate or cannot sue his way into heaven, and we've hit the tailors. Who do you think today should the porter be roasting? There's plenty of options. Obviously, adjunct theatre professor is probably the correct answer, but see if you can come up with something a little bit different. Okay, the child is asleep now, or probably so. So, here we go again. This time I want to explore the morality of Macbeth. Now, you probably have a very good question if you wanted to ask, why are we in what is a Christian college studying Macbeth? Well, you could argue, sure, won't we know better how to behave ourselves if we know how to be really bad? The morality of Macbeth is one of those stark contrasts within the world that was at that time. This is a play written for the king who commissioned the named after him King James Bible. This is a play that is talking of what was, by all accounts, an extremely religious country at the time of writing. But we're going back approximately 600 years, 700 years in history, if one is to believe the sort of the Macbeth legends that surround the play. We're going back to a time not that was pre-Christian, but was, let's say, at least pre-Protestant. It's going back, as is popular in this time, to say that the religion or the religious beliefs that were before us, they do not count. They are bankrupt in some ways. Now, poor old Jesus and God don't get a look in here at all. From the get-go, the first people we see are witches. And as I've said, the supernatural in whatever form was seen in that Anglican Britain, in that Protestant Britain, as being evil by the automatically. The notions that there could be people or beings that transcend this mortal earth but are not of God, they can only be of Satan. And that's important. Throughout the play, we start off with Macbeth as an ordinary, decent guy who's fighting for his king in a battle against Norway. For some reason, Norway is frequently the enemy in Shakespeare. But we have this ordinary, decent guy who is seduced, who is lured in Act 1, Scene 3 by these witches, by promises. Now, again, we must always remember that for the people in this era, the word of ghosts, the word of witches was immediately to be distrusted because they are the work of the devil. And this is the same here. They tell Macbeth enough truth to hook him. Now, the question for you, if you were told, well, you're now the lord of this place, and you'll soon be the lord of that place which is bigger, and eventually you'll be the king. What is your personal thought? What is your reaction? What are you going to do? Me, I'm not particularly thinking about, killing my way to get to the top. That's me. The prophecies, well, I don't buy into prophecies personally, but the prophecies that are coming from the devil are not to be trusted. If you go back to the ancient Greek theatre, there was the whole notion of hubris, the idea that of pride, and it's your fatal flaw, it comes before that fall. The hubris of Oedipus was in running from his supposed parents because he had been prophesied to kill one and marry the other. By running from them, he fails to realize that they aren't actually his parents, and in actual fact, he is running into the arms and into the chest wound of his parents to kill his father and marry his mother. There's a degree of that here. I have been given a prophecy from an evil spirit. In embracing it, I also embrace my doom and surrender my humanity. One of the most important speeches for me in the book, or in the play, comes from Lady Macbeth, the one, "Come ye spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of the direst cruelty." So she basically makes another pact. Now, you could argue very strongly that this is a very sexist play in some ways. It, again, like a lot of things, it depends on how you depict it, how you explore it, and what way you want to put it. You could argue also, by that same rationale, that how great is Lady Macbeth? She will do anything to help her husband's accession to the throne. If you want to, Shakespeare is a product of his time and a product of his morality. Women were lesser in the eyes of many, particularly in men, in this era. So women do not fare well here. Shakespeare's time, women were legally not allowed to be on stage because it was thought automatically to be a licentious behavior to be on stage. Men can manage this, but women surely could not. So you also have the difficulty of Shakespeare's writing for mostly men and men playing women. But this part transcends the standard man playing a woman thing, which most of the writers of the time do not manage to do. The morality of Lady Macbeth is not the morality of a woman, it is the morality of a person who is being played by a man. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts. Come, you spirits who interfere and are interested in the mortal life. We're not communicating to the divine, we're communicating to the base. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts. Her request of those spirits, unsex me here. Take my womanliness away. Remove from me the feminine qualities. Again, I'm not exactly agreeing with what this might say, but what it's intended to say is make a witch of me. Make me strong as a man and stronger than a man. And in this play, Lady Macbeth, in order to push Macbeth on to do his dreadful deed, has to be stronger than him. He's doubting, he's saying, oh, no. She pushes him towards the prize. Again, I don't say this in a terrible woman. I say this in the fact that she is the stronger of the two. And I say this looking at that it is a pair. These are star-crossed lovers, if you will. Certain elements of the play suggest that maybe she's pregnant at a certain point. But certainly, and there's arguments that say that she loses the baby in the middle of the play because her unsex me here speech has unsexed her. It has prevented her of being capable to bear child. There's a lot of different productions that explore that side of things. But is that the case? It's hard to say. There's nothing explicitly, oh, she's lost a baby. This is indeed distasteful talk. But this is a play about distasteful people doing distasteful things. Or perhaps people realizing their potential for evil. After they kill, they suffer consequences. This is, if you will, the lesson Shakespeare gives us. Macbeth, he feels quite jolly and on it, but he starts to see ghosts. He sees the ghost of Banquo. He sees the ghosts of the future kings. He sees, and then he takes the opportunity to go forth and meet with the witches again to, let me just check out to make sure that everything's good on the prophecy. I've done my bit. What else do I need to be aware of? You're making a pact. The first pact, if you will, you said this will happen and I'm going to do that. I'm going to make it happen. You could argue that's merely taking a prompt. You've got lovely, you look great today. Gives you that kind of feeling. Yeah, I do look great today. Maybe I'll ask that person out that I like. That's kind of what Macbeth does to a degree in killing Duncan. You could be king. Yeah, I could be king. If I killed him, I could definitely be the king. He conspires, he connives, he gets rid of Banquo, the person who could rat him out. He stitches up Malcolm and Donalbain, the sons of sons of Duncan, to make it look like they might be responsible. And then he starts checking, okay, it's not a case of I took the prompt, he took the prompt and ran with it. He goes back to the witches and they summon up Hecate, or Hecate, I should say, which is, again, an ancient Greek deity's name. They summon Hecate up, and Hecate's instructions are pure evil. It's like, yeah. Be the evil beast you are, basically. The witches tell him that there are things he should be aware. He needs be worried of no man from woman born. Only Macduff is the only person he should be wary of. And the other one is beware when Dunsinane would do come to... when Burnham would do come to Dunsinane. Pardon me, I'm getting me woods mixed up. Burnham Wood comes to Dunsinane. So there's a supernatural event, surely, that a wood should move. Macduff is from woman untimely ripped, which means he's a C-section. There was an incision made and he was pulled out because he couldn't be born in the natural fashion. Again, eerie, weird, not natural things as far as the natural way of things is. There hasn't been for some centuries, but there was wariness of people who were birthed by cesarean because, well, that's not how it's meant to happen. Personally, the more people by cesarean, the better. Safety first, folks. Safety first. Wash your hands. Wash your hands. Following on that morality, yeah, we have the initial situation where the king is killed off stage, the servants are killed off stage. So it's not looking gruesome. Then we have the ambush of Banquo, which is pretty bad, but the kid escapes at least. We're not going to get away with it. Not only do we then go on to have Macduff's wife murdered, but also her son there, both on stage. It gets more and more gruesome. Macbeth slays 2 or 3 more people on stage during the big battle, and eventually, and this is mostly done off stage, he is beheaded, and Macduff comes bearing the head in a bag or in a basket or whatever way that the production sees it fit. Gruesome acts, as though to suggest that only violence can eradicate such evil. It is an unpleasant place. You could be forgiven easily for not wishing to return to Scotland after this. Macduff and Malcolm have quite the battle ahead of them to rebuild Scotland after this horrific and gruesome experience. Arguably, you could say they had to aggressively wipe the plague that Macbeth brought upon Scotland. But before we can even get to that, we have this short scene where Macduff and Malcolm talk together. And this scene, Macduff is trying to see, will Malcolm be a decent king of Scotland? Will he be a good man? Is he the man to replace him? Of course, Malcolm gives us all these things saying, oh, no, I like the ladies. No, I like all the ladies. And he's like, well, we can deal with that. You're not a complete tyrant. Oh, but I'd be a complete tyrant. Oh, I mean, yeah, when I'm not with the ladies, I'd be being a tyrant. Only when Macduff says, oh, Scotland is lost, does Malcolm say, oh, no, I was only messing with you. I wanted to see if you truly cared about Scotland or you were just a loyalist to my father. So we're left with another question there. Is Malcolm telling the truth when he's talking about how evil he is? Is he telling the truth when he's saying he isn't? There's a lot of questions. Scotland is not going to be in a good situation from what we can tell until perhaps the children of Fleance return. What has changed in producing Macbeth? It's always been popular and it's been going on for centuries now. Mostly how it changes is like all plays. They should be a reaction and a response to the world in which we live. If you see Medea done today, even if it's done in togas, the whole lot, in theory, it should be speaking to the audience of 21st century Louisville rather than an audience of 5th century BC Greece. And so it is with Shakespeare. The great plays change. Quite a while ago, maybe 80 years ago, King Lear was considered a very important play, but it wasn't particularly regularly performed. Generally speaking, it had fallen out of favour because it was seen as being too bleak, too dark, too unforgiving. And then we went through World War II. We went through the Holocaust. We went through unimaginable pain and suffering in what was then the Soviet Union. We went through shocking prisoner camps throughout the Pacific Basin. It seemed as though, to many Jewish writers of the time, that history had ended. This was a time for King Lear, a time when an old regime is being flushed out. World War II ended so many of the various different royal houses' sovereignty in Europe, and it opened up to a wide degree more democratic and non-inherited governance. So King Lear became... Hang on, there's a cat that wants to get in here. King Lear became a great play again. Macbeth has managed to stay that way, partly for a number of reasons. Partly the morality of it. We see the very worst, and that there is still hope when the very worst is there. Macbeth is, if you will, a government installed by a combination of witches and witchcraft. But they can be overturned. I mean, Macbeth's right-hand man is called Satan. S-E-Y-T-O-N. Sometimes S-E-Y-T-O-N is pronounced Seton, but I'm going to go with Satan as the pronunciation of it. So if that can happen, if the worst government can be overthrown, so too can whatever government we have that we don't like at the moment. Not mentioning anything political directly, it could apply to wherever. So it's going to retain its power. It's a military warlike situation. So the current vogue, and not a vogue I have any problem with, is to reimagine these plays in a more modern context. Oftentimes, what it was for most of the 80s and 90s was it's going to be taking place in World War II. And so there are a number of versions that take place in World War II. You saw the 5 different openings, actually. That's a good example. There was the World War I version, which was the one that has Captain Picard as Macbeth. That World War I version, where the witches are nurses, the people you would expect to be the good guys, it really follows through and it makes some sense. Some have done it with it being an analogy to the rise of fascism, that Macbeth is sort of like a Hitler-like or Mussolini-like character, and have interpreted it that way. I have every confidence that there are people who are going to do it with the likes of pick your least favorite leader in this country or any other country as that Macbeth character. The idea that here is somebody who promises change, and no, this change is not good. The best version I saw starred a guy called Anthony Sher, who is a very, very famous South African actor who is one of the true great 20th century, 21st century Shakespearean actors. And I can't remember who was Lady Macbeth in it. Oh, I've gone blank on that. It was 2 hours flat, and it was in the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, which is in Stratford-upon-Avon, the place where that fella Shakespeare was born. It didn't exist then. They built it much more recently. That production had it very much feeling like it was set in the Bosnian War, which had at that time only been 10 years previous. That Yugoslavia tearing itself apart. This was sort of one of the seams that crack pulled along across. The Duncan character, the king, was played very much like Marshal Tito, who was the leader of Yugoslavia, and there weren't many elements of overlap, but in the demeanor, not the physical appearance, but how Cher held Macbeth in his bones, had some echoes of Slobodan Milosevic. So you have this very strong sense of this is a play about chaos, about war, about government, about power. I hate to say it, but we're never going to get rid of war, much as I would like us to. Because at the end of the day, we are fighting this plague, for want of a better term, that's going across our world, and we're describing it in terms warlike. That we're battling, that we are going to draw all these lines of defense and so forth. Power and power vacuums. We're talking Star Trek stuff if we're going to get past that. And then even then it's a united power of the planet Earth and the Federation against the rest. Power goes hand in hand with governance. Sometimes the power gets abused, even by those we like as much as those we don't like. That keeps it regular and keeps it relevant. So it's going to keep getting produced. Before I finish up, there are two things that I'm going to mention. One production, or two productions in particular, that I thought were stunning. There was an Irish production about 20 years ago by a company called Barabbas. And what they did was they had a cast of 5. There was Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and the 3 witches. Which way? There. 3 witches, Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth. And what they did, because there's a lot more characters than that, the witches had little sticks with heads on them, and a wide variety of them. And every time some character went to speak, maybe it's Lennox, or Ross, or Duncan, they'd pick up the appropriate stick. The set was like, you know those jungle gym type things that you get in the big playgrounds that are like almost like a gigantic dome, geodesic type dome, and they are, you can climb over them. This was the set for the play. There were 3 people playing the witches. I think it was 1 man, 2 man, I can't remember, and a woman. The witches were basically scampering all over this climbing frame and poking in the heads of the different other characters when they had to speak. Currently, there is a production, or there was, sorry, probably not in plague times, there was a production going on in New York called Sleep No More. And it's very experimental work. You pay a stupid amount of money, and then you go into this big building. It's not a theatre. And you journey through the rooms. You meet in this big lobby, we'll say, where you can buy drinks and what have you, and there's constantly singing going on. There's actors doing all kinds of things, and you walk from room to room and experience a moment of that play. Now, it could be a moment where she's going mad. You might move from one room to another, and one of the characters moves with you. It's very interactive. You don't get so much of that stuff over here. I've seen a lot more of it in Central Europe and a little bit in London, but this is a really intriguing play to take that with. The most scary, weird play. If you're going to attend this play, you've got to wear a mask. They'll give you a mask. And as long as you've got your mask on, you're allowed to watch. But if you cross the line as an audience member, if you reach out and touch one of the actors, they remove your mask and you're meant to be taken away. What's fascinating is several people who have had their masks removed are drawn back to it again, or they come back because, I don't know, there's something strange and transgressive. The atmosphere that this play creates. For most of us, it tells us, that's a bad place, man, I don't want to go there. For some, it's an invitation to where they want to be. Avoid those people in life if you can. That's it. That's today's class. Hope you enjoyed some of it. I have one last thing that I want you to do. So as well as tell me who the porter should have a go at, as well as picking a type of play that you can see as being similar to a movie you like or a TV show you like, I want you to pick a genre that you think Macbeth might work in. You know, like maybe science fiction or period romance or whatever. Pick one. Doesn't have to be clever. You don't have to rationalize it. Pick a genre that you think might fit with Macbeth. Next week is the writing week. I'll be giving you email updates that week and keeping on top of things with you, hopefully. There's an email a little while back that has all the details. I might include it in the notes for this one about potential essays or potential personal perspectives. And hopefully during the next however many days between now and then, I will work out what will be the rest of the curriculum. I only heard maybe half an hour ago that the Derby is being put back to September. My expectation is I'm not going to see you guys before the end of class. So, we have a cat come in. There we are living in the world of Shakespeare, all right, or living in the world of Macbeth. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Well, keep out of the filthy air. Don't be breathing in the bad stuff. I will email you next week and hopefully have an idea of a curriculum by the end of it. Talk to you soon. Stay well. Good luck with the writing. Oh, and yeah, email me. Get me this email by the middle of next week, telling me what are the things you saw in response to what I've asked you to do for this one. See you soon. Bye.